number can be squared, including a negative number. To square a negative number, we do the same thing. We multiply the number times itself. So negative 6 times negative 6 would be positive 36. Because when we multiply negatives, negatives times negatives gives us a positive value. So that tells us the perfect square is always going to be a positive value. Now, when we start using exponents, notation matters. Here we have negative 4 squared with no parentheses. Well, in this case, that negative sign means the opposite of 4 squared. So that would mean the opposite of 4 times 4. Well, 4 times 4 would be 16, so that would be the opposite of 16, which would come out to give us a negative 16. If we wanted to come out like we did up here, we need to include parentheses. When we include the parentheses around the negative value, that tells us that we want the quantity squared. So the quantity of negative 4 times the quantity of negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 4 is going to come out to give us positive 16. So when you're working with negative numbers and exponents, pay very close attention to how to interpret that negative sign. If squaring a negative number gives us a positive product, then that means all perfect squares should actually have 2 square roots. Square root of 25 should be positive 5, and square root of 25 should be negative 5. So how do we know which one we're talking about if we're just told to take the square root? Well, unless notated otherwise, we're talking about the principal square root, or the positive value. That radical symbol implies that we're always looking at the positive square root. How do we notate it if we want it to be the negative square root? Well, again, this is where notation and interpreting it matters. If we put the negative sign outside of our radical, that tells us we're looking for the opposite of the square root of 25. So square root of 25, we just said, implies that we're looking for the positive value, so that's the 5. But this negative sign tells us we're looking for the opposite of that, so the opposite of positive 5 would be negative 5. Well, what about taking the square root of a negative number? This is where we're going to start using imaginary numbers when we have to go to simplify that radical. If we want to take the square root of negative 9, the first thing we need to do is rewrite that as a factor pair of negative 1 times the number, or negative 1 times 9. When we take the square root of negative 1, this is where our imaginary number comes in. The square root of negative 1 is I, or an imaginary number. From there, we can simplify the rest of our radical. 9 is a perfect square, so the square root of 9 is simply 3. So when we put those together, the square root of negative 9 is going to become 3i. Check out the other videos in our playlist, and don't forget to click on subscribe. Thanks for watching!